Ethan Blaze Carter, Liam Knuckles O'Donnell, and Marcus Ghost Hayes. 3 names that would send fear through the streets of London. Over just 31 hours, they turned the city into their battlefield, leaving rivals beaten, neighborhoods terrified, and the police scrambling. This is the story of how a gang rose from shadows, ruled with ruthless precision, and left a legacy of chaos that even prison walls couldn't contain. East London, in the late nights, was a place where ambition met desperation. Narrow streets echoed with the sound of footsteps, and smoky pubs hid more than just regular drinkers. It was in these shadows that a new kind of nightmare was born. A group of young men, tired of scraping coins from pickpocketing and small thefts, began to tag of something far larger. Their world was filled with poverty, broken homes, and endless fights for survival. To them, crime wasn't a choice. It was the only way forward. What started as petty jobs soon grew into careful planning, and the man pulling the strings was unlike any other. He was cold, calculated, and willing to do whatever it took to rise above the streets. This leader, known only by his street name, carried himself like he was already untouchable. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but his intelligence made him dangerous. He studied the movements of delivery trucks, learned the blind spots of local shops, and mapped out escape routes through alleys and abandoned buildings. With every small job, his crew became sharper, faster, and hungrier for more. They stopped being boys chasing coins and started to become men building an empire. Their first real score was a betting shop on a Friday night. The place was busy, cash-heavy, and poorly guarded. Armed with knives and masks, they stormed in, grabbing handfuls of notes before anyone could raise the alarm. The entire job lasted less than 3 minutes. They disappeared into the maze of London streets, splitting the money in the back of a crumbling warehouse. That night the leader made it clear, this was just the beginning. The crew believed him, and from that moment, loyalty wasn't optional, it was survival. Word began to spread. In pubs and markets, people whispered about a new gang in town, one that moved like ghosts and struck with precision. Rival groups laughed at first, thinking they were just another band of reckless kids. But soon, those laughs turned to silence. The newcomers weren't afraid to use violence, and when a rival dealer tried to block their path, he was found beaten so badly he could no longer walk. The message was simple: step aside or suffer the consequences. The gang grew bolder with each success. They started hijacking vans filled with electronics, smuggling cigarettes through the docks, and shaking down local businesses for protection money. Shopkeepers paid quietly, knowing the price of saying no was too high. Even the police started to notice. Reports piled up of robberies with the same fingerprints, but the gang left no witnesses willing to speak. Fear was spreading faster than the crimes themselves. For the crew, life was changing. They went from wearing second-hand clothes to driving stolen cars, flashing cash in nightclubs, and walking with the kind of confidence only power can give. But beneath the excitement, a darker truth lingered. Every crime pulled them deeper into a world where enemies multiplied and survival meant blood would eventually be spilled. The nightmare of East London wasn't just starting, it was preparing to consume everything in its path. The rise of the gang could not go unnoticed for long. East London had always been a battlefield of turf and reputation, and every corner already belonged to someone. Rival groups who had built their names over years suddenly found their profits shrinking. Their dealers were being pushed out, their businesses were being threatened, and customers were too afraid to buy from them. The newcomers were young, ruthless, and unshaken by the rules of the old guard. The older gangs considered it disrespect, but what truly lit the fuse was money. Territory meant control, and control meant wealth. No one was willing to share. The first blood came quietly. A rival crew tried to scare the new gang by slashing the tires of their getaway car after a job. It was meant to be a warning, nothing more. But the leader saw it as a declaration of war. Within a week, the man responsible was cornered in a back alley and beaten until he could no longer speak. The message was clear: this new force would never bow to intimidation. From that moment, whispers in pubs turned into loud talk of war. Tension filled the streets like smoke. Every night felt heavier. Every pub meeting watched with suspicion. Rival crews gathered in hidden rooms, plotting revenge. The gang, meanwhile, prepared for the inevitable. They armed themselves not just with knives, but with stolen handguns, a rare and dangerous escalation in the local underworld. Where others hesitated, they showed no fear. Violence was not a risk for them. It was a weapon of reputation. The clash came late one night on the cobblestones of an industrial yard. A deal had been set up, but it was never meant to go through. It was a trap, carefully planned by rivals who wanted to erase the newcomers in one sweep. But the gang's leader had already been tipped off. When the rivals arrived, expecting an easy kill, they found themselves under a rain of bullets and blades. The chaos was brutal, short, and unforgettable. When it was over, 3 men lay dead, their blood painting the ground in thick pools that glistened under the dim streetlights. News of the killings spread faster than fire. For the first time, newspapers picked up the story, calling it a gang feud. Reporters wrote of rising violence, but no one outside the underworld truly understood the scale. Those who lived nearby didn't need headlines. They heard the screams, they saw the bodies being taken away, and they felt the fear seeping into every corner of their lives. The police increased patrols, but few dared speak out. Witnesses vanished, either too terrified to testify or silenced before they could. In the underworld, the killings only added to the gang's reputation. They weren't just surviving the war, they were winning it. Older groups who once mocked them now spoke their name with caution. In a city already filled with crime, a new empire was clawing its way to the top, and it was being built with blood. It began with a storm rolling over London, thunder echoing across the rooftops, as if the city itself was warning of what was about to unfold. For 31 relentless hours, chaos spread through the streets, leaving police scrambling and the public terrified. The gang, now stronger than ever, had been planning this spree for weeks. Every move was mapped out, every detail rehearsed. To outsiders it looked like madness, a string of violent crimes with no clear goal. But to the gang it was a show of dominance, a message that they were the new rulers of the underworld. The first strike came at dawn. A jewelry shop in the heart of the East End was hit with precision. Armed men stormed in, smashing glass cases and scooping up diamonds and gold. Security alarms screamed through the morning air, but by the time police arrived, the gang had already vanished into the warren of side streets. They didn't just take the goods, they left behind a wrecked storefront that made the city feel exposed and fragile. By midday, the second act unfolded. A delivery truck carrying electronics was hijacked on a busy road. Witnesses watched in shock as masked men forced the driver out and sped away with the vehicle, leaving traffic frozen in chaos. Hours later, the goods were already being unloaded into hidden warehouses, ready to be sold on the black market. The gang's efficiency was chilling. They moved with the discipline of soldiers, not reckless criminals. Nightfall brought fire. A nightclub belonging to one of their rivals erupted in flames, the blaze lighting up the sky like a beacon of destruction. It wasn't just arson, it was a declaration of war, carried out while partygoers fled in panic. The gang wanted the entire city to see their reach, to feel their anger. The fire crews battled through the night, but the damage was done. The rivals' empire had taken a fatal hit. The rampage didn't slow. Robberies continued across different parts of the city, small betting shops, cash-in-transit vans, even a warehouse stocked with designer clothing. Each crime was different, yet all were executed with the same ruthless precision. The timing was so fast and unpredictable that investigators struggled to keep up. One detective later described it as trying to chase shadows, always one step behind, always arriving too late. As the hours ticked by, fear spread faster than the crimes themselves. Shopkeepers shut early, neighborhoods went quiet, and ordinary people stayed locked inside their homes. Rumors flooded the streets. Some claimed the gang had hundreds of members. Others whispered they had inside men in the police. Whether true or not, the effect was the same. The city felt paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare of uncertainty. By the end of the 31 hours, the gang had made millions in stolen goods, left rivals in ruins, and embarrassed the authorities. It was a display of raw power that etched their name into British gangland history. For them, it was proof that they were untouchable. For everyone else, it was the terrifying realization that order had been shattered and fear now ruled the streets. The 31-hour spree should have been the end of them. Any other gang would have been crushed under the weight of police raids, manhunts, and constant surveillance. But what made this group different was their ability to slip through every net. They seemed untouchable, and the more the authorities tried to close in, the stronger their legend became. On the surface, they were criminals running wild. Beneath it, they were a network of carefully hidden connections, fear-driven silence, and possibly something darker, corruption within the very system meant to stop them. Detectives worked day and night, but every lead evaporated. Informants disappeared without warning, either skipping town in fear or ending up in hospital beds after accidents. Witnesses refused to give statements, even when promised protection. In some cases they outright denied seeing anything, though everyone knew they had watched the crimes unfold. People had seen what happened to others who spoke out, and no one was willing to risk their lives or their families for the sake of justice. Behind the scenes, whispers began about officers who might have been feeding the gang inside information. Every time a raid was planned, the gang seemed to be one step ahead, already gone before the doors were kicked down. Every time a stash house was identified, it turned up empty, as if the criminals had been tipped off only hours before. No proof ever surfaced, but the suspicion alone was enough to shake public trust. If the police themselves couldn't be trusted, then who could stand against this growing empire? The press fueled the fire. Newspapers splashed dramatic headlines across their front pages, calling the gang the ghosts of London and painting them as an unstoppable force. Television news aired footage of burning nightclubs, hijacked trucks, and shattered shopfronts. Ordinary people were glued to their screens, horrified but fascinated. The gang had become more than a criminal organization, they were a myth in the making, and myths are far harder to destroy than men. The fear was not limited to the streets. Politicians faced questions about why crime was spiraling out of control, while rival gangs grew cautious. Some groups chose to step aside, cutting their losses rather than risk going to war with men who seemed above consequence. Others tried to test the waters, only to find themselves buried, figuratively and sometimes literally. The balance of power in London's underworld was shifting, and it was shifting fast. Inside the gang, wealth poured in. They flaunted their success in clubs and casinos, driving stolen luxury cars and wearing clothes that screamed money. Yet even in their arrogance, they operated with discipline. No one in the crew acted without the leader's permission, and every crime was carried out with near-military precision. Their ability to combine chaos with control made them more dangerous than anyone could have predicted. To the average Londoner, the streets no longer felt safe. To the authorities, the city was slipping out of their grasp, and to the gang, every headline, every rumor, every whisper of fear was proof that they had achieved what few criminals ever could, the status of being untouchable. Power, wealth, and fear had long been the glue holding the gang together, but nothing lasts forever. Even in a crew built on loyalty and intimidation, cracks began to appear. The first signs were subtle: delayed meetings, whispered conversations, and suspicious glances. One lieutenant, ambitious and resentful, felt he had earned more than he was given. He watched the leader take the largest share of every haul, while the rest of the crew scraped by. Slowly, a seed of betrayal began to grow in his mind. At first, it was just small acts of disobedience. The lieutenant missed scheduled pickups, delayed deliveries, and withheld minor information. The leader noticed, but dismissed it as human error, unaware that each small act was a test of loyalty. Behind the scenes, the lieutenant began reaching out to rivals and even passing crumbs of information to detectives. Every tip was calculated, designed to weaken the gang without drawing attention to himself. He wanted revenge, and he wanted power. But most of all, he wanted to prove that he could play a bigger game than the man who had made him a criminal. As the betrayal deepened, paranoia spread through the crew. Jobs that once ran like clockwork began to falter. Alarms were triggered, deliveries went missing, and rival gangs started to anticipate their moves. The once unshakable empire showed signs of vulnerability. Members whispered in corners, trying to figure out who could be trusted. No one knew that the real danger was not outside forces, but from within. The lieutenant's manipulation reached a terrifying peak when he orchestrated a trap for the leader's closest allies. Using false intelligence, he lured them into an ambush that left several wounded and one dead. The survivors were shaken, realizing that the streets were no longer their only threat. Even those who had been loyal for years could fall victim to ambition and greed. Fear, which had once been a tool to control rivals, now ran through the gang like wildfire, turning friend against friend. The leader, though wounded by the betrayal, refused to show weakness. He began tightening control, assigning trusted members as surveillance and counterintelligence within the gang. He interrogated associates quietly, trying to root out the traitor, but the lieutenant was always one step ahead, careful to cover his tracks. His dual game of deception was working perfectly. He remained inside the gang while slowly dismantling it from within. The consequences of betrayal extended beyond the gang itself. Rival crews noticed the internal discord and attempted to exploit it. Small skirmishes broke out in the streets, each one testing the weakened cohesion of the once feared organization. Families and associates lived in a constant state of tension, unsure if the next attack would come from enemies or friends. The streets that had once belonged to the gang were no longer safe, and even their reputation as untouchable predators was beginning to crack. By the end of this chapter of internal warfare, it was clear that the empire was changing. Loyalty had been replaced by suspicion, and fear was now directed inward as much as outward. The lieutenant's betrayal had set a chain reaction that would lead to paranoia, mistrust, and ultimately, the downfall of the empire. The gang had survived countless battles outside, but the war within proved to be the most dangerous of all. The empire that had once ruled the streets with an iron fist was beginning to crumble, and the leader's arrogance had become his greatest weakness. Years of success and fear had blinded him to the fact that the walls around him were no longer secure. Allies were suspicious, enemies were emboldened, and the police had begun to piece together a strategy to finally bring him down. The final act of his reign would not be a daring heist or violent clash. It would be a desperate fight for survival in a warehouse on the outskirts of London. The police had received a tip-off, one carefully orchestrated through weeks of surveillance and intelligence work. For the first time, law enforcement was ready to hit with full force. Armed units, tactical teams, and undercover officers surrounded the location as the gang prepared for what they believed would be just another job. Inside, the leader and his closest allies moved with confidence, unaware that the trap had already been set. Every door, window, and escape route was now blocked, turning the once safe warehouse into a cage. The standoff began as the police called for surrender, but the leader refused. Years of untouchable power had left him believing that no one could corner him. Shots were fired, shattering the tense silence. The gang responded with a ferocity that had become their signature. Bullets ricocheted, traits were overturned, and smoke filled the air. Outside, tactical teams maneuvered carefully, coordinating their movements with precision. The chaos inside mirrored the empire's rise, violent, unpredictable, and dangerous. Hours passed. Negotiators tried to reason with the gang, but the leader remained defiant, refusing to give in. He believed he could escape, that his cunning and street knowledge would save him. Yet with each passing minute, the walls closed in. Police snipers and assault teams carefully picked positions, cutting off any potential exit. Supplies were dwindling, tensions skyrocketed, and even the most loyal members of the crew began to doubt their chances of survival. Then came the final blow. A small tactical breach allowed officers to enter the warehouse from a rear entrance, surprising the gang. Caught between the assault team and barricades, the leader realized his empire had finally failed. In a desperate attempt to flee, he collided with one of his own traps, a hidden wire meant for intruders, and fell to the ground. Handcuffs followed moments later. The man who had once terrorized East London now sat in the back of a police van, stunned, defeated, and powerless. The aftermath was immediate and dramatic. Millions in stolen goods were seized, firearms and explosives confiscated, and the gang structure shattered. Associates fled, some captured later, others vanished into the shadows. The streets that had once trembled under their influence felt a rare sense of calm. News outlets splashed the story across headlines. The untouchable king had fallen. Yet even in defeat, the leader's reputation endured. People whispered about his cunning, his rise, and the chaos he had left behind. For law enforcement, it was a victory hard-earned. For the gang, it was a stark reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, could survive betrayal, arrogance, and the relentless pressure of justice. The fall had been inevitable, but the legend would linger long after the warehouse doors closed. Even behind bars, the gang's influence did not wane. The streets had been their playground, but prison became another battlefield, a place where control was measured in fear, intimidation, and careful manipulation. The leader, now confined to a cell for life, quickly adapted to the new rules. Though physically restrained, he continued to command loyalty, directing operations through trusted messengers and coded communications. Every member of the crew who remained outside or had been incarcerated under his orders became an extension of his will, ensuring that the empire he had built on the streets survived, even behind prison walls. Inside, the prison environment was a different kind of war zone. Rival inmates tested strength and influence, but the gang's reputation preceded them. Some joined willingly, seeking protection and a share of power. Others tried to resist, only to face swift retribution. Assaults, threats, and intimidation became common tools, and soon the gang was effectively running parts of the prison. Guards turned a blind eye to some activities, wary of the consequences of interference. Even the administration had to acknowledge that the gang's reach extended beyond the physical boundaries of the facility. From their cells, the leader coordinated drug trafficking, extortion, and even targeted violence on the outside. Couriers and visitors carried messages, encrypted and disguised, ensuring that instructions reached loyal members without detection. Deals were struck, alliances forged, and rival crews monitored. By the time word reached the outside world, the gang's operations were so sophisticated that police often found themselves reacting rather than leading. Every crime that occurred outside was a reminder that confinement had not diminished their power. The prison walls also became a place of psychological warfare. Fear and respect were carefully cultivated. New inmates quickly learned the hierarchy and the consequences of crossing the gang. Older prisoners who had once been untouchable elsewhere found themselves either compelled to join or forced to submit. Violence was not always necessary. The knowledge of the gang's omnipresence was often enough to bend wills. The leader's legend grew, now fueled by whispers of omnipotence that even confinement could not erase. Meanwhile, rival gangs on the outside attempted to exploit what they thought was a weakness. With the leader behind bars, they assumed the empire would falter, but they underestimated the structure and discipline the gang had established. Each loyal member operated with autonomy, making independent decisions that served the greater strategy. Any attempt to challenge them was met with calculated retaliation, whether through street violence, sabotage, or legal intimidation. The empire, though fractured, remained operational and dangerous. Families, associates, and even casual bystanders felt the gang's reach. Neighborhoods once scarred by crime now lived with a subtle, persistent tension. People whispered of the leader's ability to strike through the prison walls, of hits carried out at his direction, and of debts collected in ways both legal and illegal. Fear was no longer just a tool, it was a constant presence, as pervasive as the city's skyline. In this new phase, the gang had evolved. Confinement did not mean defeat, It meant adaptation. The streets might have belonged to the outside world, but power, control, and influence had been extended into a domain few understood. The empire behind bars was a stark reminder. Imprisonment could contain bodies, but it could not contain ambition, cunning, or the enduring reach of fear. Even after the arrests, the story of the gang did not end. On the streets of London, the echoes of their reign continued to ripple through neighborhoods, pubs, and back alleys. Young recruits, inspired by tales of their daring heists, speed, and untouchable reputation, began to take up the gang's name. They were drawn not just by the promise of money, but by the legend of fear, the idea that power could be measured in the terror it inspired. The city, which had briefly felt the relief of law enforcement victories, now faced a new generation shaped by the myths of the past. Families who had once lived under the shadow of the gang knew that fear does not fade quickly. Mothers whispered warnings to children, shopkeepers locked doors earlier than necessary, and ordinary citizens avoided streets that had once been neutral ground. Even those who had never directly encountered the gang understood that the streets were still unsafe. Stories of violent reprisals, sudden disappearances, and coded threats traveled faster than the police could act, leaving an invisible mark on the community. The gang had become more than a criminal organization. It was now a symbol, a warning that the underworld had long memories and enduring influence. Inside prison walls, the original leaders remained influential. They were no longer free to roam the city, but their strategic genius and ability to inspire loyalty kept the criminal network alive. Messages still flowed through visitors, coded letters, and corrupt intermediaries. Each plan executed outside the prison gates reminded the public and the authorities that power cannot always be confined. The leader, once captured in a dramatic standoff, was now regarded as a legend, a figure whose cunning and ruthlessness could not be erased by time or incarceration. On the streets, rival gangs tried to fill the vacuum left by arrests, but none could match the organization, discipline, or fear that the original gang had instilled. Turf wars continued, but the rules had changed. Everyone understood the cost of overreach, and many new players chose caution over confrontation. Even when violence erupted, it was often framed within the shadow of the gang's influence, reminders that the ghosts of the past still walked among them. The media continued to feed the legend, recounting tales of daring heists, bloody betrayals, and the audacious 31-hour spree that had first captured national attention. Documentaries, news articles, and social media posts immortalized the gang, blending fact and folklore until it became almost impossible to separate truth from myth. The public fascination persisted, fueling an endless cycle of storytelling and fear. People were terrified yet captivated, knowing that the underworld's reach extended far beyond what could be seen. Ultimately, the legacy of the gang was measured not in arrests or prison sentences, but in the lasting culture of fear and respect they left behind. Streets, businesses, and families were forever marked by their influence. For those who lived through their reign, the lessons were clear. Power can be fleeting, but fear endures. Control can be challenged, but reputation can survive anything. In Britain's criminal underworld, names are remembered, myths are born, and the stories of one gang can shape generations. Even in defeat, the gang had won something far more permanent, a legacy that time, law enforcement, and imprisonment could never fully erase.